Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and thanks to Greg and the CrossFit team for inviting me and being so interested in my work. Really pleased to be here. Let's see if I can make this work. So yes, I want to give you a little bit of my personal backstory to begin with. And I was working at Kaiser, as Zoe mentioned, although I was on the administrative side, so I was actually managing dental clinics for Kaiser, and we were really interested in medical dental integration. Type 2 diabetic patients show up in the dental office, and there is the opportunity for dentists to maybe measure blood glucose and partner with Kaiser physicians in managing type 2 diabetic patients. So I went to a dental conference looking at the links between gum disease and diabetes back in 2007. And I was given this brochure, Working Together to Manage Diabetes, and this was designed for dentists in particular. And I noticed that the diet advice, this is what it said, to manage type 2 diabetes, you should increase fiber, limit saturated fats, and salt. And that's what would help control blood glucose, blood pressure, and cholesterol. What's missing? What's missing from that statement? Nothing about sugar. There's nothing about reducing sugar. So that was a little unusual. And this was put out by the CDC, our National Diabetes Education Program. There was a second keynote speaker at this conference, and he handed out this guide, his Stop and Go Fast Food Guide to Nutrition. And one of the drinks that he gave a green light to was Lipton Brisk Sweet Tea, which has something like 56 grams of sugar. This was him, Stephen Aldana. I actually chased him down. He was trying to leave and get out to catch his flight and said, how can you possibly give this drink a green light? And his answer was, there is no evidence linking sugar to chronic disease. And I was literally speechless because we were at a dental conference, Tooth decay is the #1 chronic disease in children. You can't deny the link between sugar and tooth decay. I really had no words, and he just turned around and walked out the door. So that's not what I expected to learn at this dental conference. And so at the time, I had also been reading books by Gary Taubes, who we've heard a lot about here today, as well as Marion Nestle, her book, Food Politics. And if you don't know Marion, she has an amazing blog called Food Politics and has written something like 15 books on the topic. But in her book, she was talking about how the sugar industry had worked to lobby the US dietary guidelines. So I got really curious about the sugar industry, and I wanted to know more. So I'd come home after work and just start looking at online. Who is the sugar industry, and what are they up to? And this is a screenshot from the website of the Sugar Association from back in 2007. So here they're boasting that sugar had been subject to scientific scrutiny. Over 1,000 studies had dispelled the links between sugar, diabetes, hypertension, behavior problems, and obesity. And then here they're listing these government reports, the FDA, National Academy of Sciences, that supposedly also had exonerated sugar from being linked to chronic disease. And this is how I felt. What is going on with these reports? I just couldn't believe what I was reading. I was almost thinking, did I learn something wrong in dental school, about links between sugar and disease? I started really questioning things. So I got rid of cable TV and decided I'm going to just do this after work, and I'm going to start really digging into the sugar industry and figure out what's going on. After a year, I quit my job and started doing it full time. At this point, I'd moved back to Colorado, and I was picking up some books at our local Denver Public Library, and I typed sugar into the library catalog, and records to the Great Western Sugar Company popped up. So this is a sugar company, Sugar Beet company, that based in Denver, Colorado. They went out of business in the 1970s and decided to donate company records to local libraries in Colorado. Apparently, lawyers did screen through these documents, but a few boxes on nutrition and nutrition policy slipped through. And I just happened to be the first one to go up and take a look. So the very first folder that I opened had this exact document with the Sugar Association's letterhead across the top, confidential. So I knew that I was onto something good. This is how I felt after I found those documents. So what I had stumbled upon, the collection at Colorado State University was a collection of photographs, actually. And they kept some of the textual documents to give context to the photographs. And so this was the photograph that was key. This is a picture of J.W. Tatum there on the right, the president of the Sugar Association, accepting the Silver Anvil Award, which is given by the Public Relations Society of America. It's like winning an Oscar if you're in the public relations world. And they won this award in 1976. And so I had all the documents kind of supporting what went on with this public relations campaign. But I didn't know how I was going to get the story out because I was a dentist. I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't trained in research. I didn't know how I was going to write about this. So I actually kind of chased down Gary Taubes. I sent him an email, and he didn't write me back. And then I was a little depressed because I thought maybe I really wasn't onto something that good. And then he was on a book tour in Denver for Why We Get Fat. And I went up to him after his talk, and we got to talking and ended up writing an article together. So we had an article that came out in Mother Jones in 2012, and it was telling the story of this 1976 public relations campaign about that Silver Anvil Award. So this, on the left, this is a report from the Sugar Association's Board of Directors. I had their financial statements, all the research projects that they'd funded, all their memos going back and forth between the Sugar Association and executives of the sugar companies. And Zoe was mentioning earlier the 1977 McGovern report. What this one was about was a 1976 Food and Drug Administration report. So while McGovern and his Senate committee were looking at dietary goals, the Food and Drug Administration was actually undergoing a massive review of their list of foods that were considered safe. And sucrose was being reviewed. It had been deemed safe in 1958 without much of a scientific review. 1976 was the first time the FDA was really looking at the evidence to say whether or not sugar was safe. So the industry knew that dietary goals report was going on, but they were more worried about this FDA report. So this article sort of tells the story of everything that they did to influence that report. Here's a quote from this board of directors meeting saying, "The fact that no confirmed scientific evidence links sugar to the death-dealing diseases is the lifeblood of the Sugar Association," just to give you a sense for their motivation. And the impact of that public relations campaign, 1976, this is the FDA report that came out. The sugar industry was boasting that this FDA report was highly supportive, making it unlikely that sugar would be subject to legislative restriction in the coming years. So this actually was a really crucial report. They did acknowledge a link between sugar and tooth decay, but everything else, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, were all dismissed in this report. So I'd written this article. Now what? I knew about UCSF. And UCSF is a place where they house the tobacco industry documents. So all the public documents that came out through discovery, through the tobacco litigation going back to the 60s and 70s, all those documents are online at UCSF and searchable, and there's a research program that's developed around that. And this man on the left, Stan Glantz, I don't know if any of you know him here, but he's really been a pioneer in studying the tobacco companies, and he received the first boxes of tobacco industry documents back in the 90s, and he and his colleagues wrote this book, The Cigarette Papers, kind of explaining what was in these documents. So I really wanted to go to UCSF. So I used that Mother Jones article to reach out to Stan and say, hey, you guys interested in what I'm doing? And it turns out they had read the article kind of the same day, and Stan was getting ready to email me. And he invited me to come give a talk, and that led to a fellowship at UCSF. So when I showed up at UCSF, I had 4 different collections of sugar company documents. So that one at Colorado State, big one at University of Florida, another one at University of Illinois, and then another one at Harvard. And Gary actually helped fund me. I was driving around the country, going to these libraries and photocopying all of these documents. And then just to give you a sense for how many collections we have now that are in the UCSF library, we've identified quite a few more, and even some in Vancouver in BC as well. So I've focused mainly on the sucrose industry. And this map gives you a sense for the sweetener industry in the US. So the yellow is corn. The corn industry is important as well. The red is sugarcane. And the green is sugar beets. And the little dots are various places where we refine sugar across the country. And I think the sucrose industry is important because historically, sucrose has been the major global sweetener, and they've been around the longest, and they've been in this game the longest. So much of what I've done has focused on this particular industry, and in particular on this trade association, the Sugar Association. So they're based in Washington, D.C. They're a 501c6 company. Their mission is to promote sugar consumption, and they do this through scientific programs, public relations, education, and public policy. And the Sugar Association really dates back to at least the 40s, and really it goes before that as well. 1943 was the year that the cane sugar and the beet sugar industries started working together. Before that, they were competitors. So in 1943, they started working together, and they were first known as the Sugar Research Foundation, and they've evolved in all kinds of different ways. They were international to begin with, but they really went international in the 1960s. And now there's the World Sugar Research Organization that's based in London, and the US version, the Sugar Association. And these are all the World Sugar Research Organization members all over the world. So all the countries that have any kind of a cane sugar or beet sugar business all have a membership in this World Sugar Research Organization. And Coca-Cola has been a member on and off, as has the International Life Sciences Institute. And this is just a screenshot of our food industry documents archive as it is now at UCSF. You can just Google Industry Documents Library. So we've got our tobacco collection. We actually also have a drug pharmaceutical collection. We have a chemical collection, which Carrie's documents are in. Many of the ones that she talked about are there. And then now our food library, which we launched in November 2018. So I'm going to just give you some of our highlights, some of our papers. Some of our key findings, but actually one thing I want to point out is now with all these different libraries online, they're also cross-searchable. So you could type in sugar and something from the tobacco industry might pop up. And this is an example of that. So this is from the Tobacco Industry Documents Library. This is Robert Hockett. He was the Sugar Research Foundation's first scientific director. He worked for them between 1943 and about 1952. The date of this letter is 1954. This is the year that the tobacco companies started to get very nervous about the links between smoking and cancer, and they hired Hill & Knowlton, a public relations firm, to help them be part of the solution. And they made this big announcement in newspapers all over the country in 1954 that they were going to form this thing called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee that was going to help, improve health. But really, we know that they were casting doubt on the links between smoking and cancer. So this letter, Robert Hockett wrote to the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, and he told them that 10 years ago, a very similar organization, the Sugar Research Foundation, was formed to investigate charges that refined sugar is a primary cause of diabetes, tooth decay, polio, B vitamin deficiencies, and obesity. And then he had organized and directed research projects in medical schools, hospitals, universities, and colleges, which had exonerated sugar of most of the charges that had been laid against it. And then he went on to say that the problems of the cigarette industry are so similar to the problems of the sugar industry that I believe that I could do good work for you. And indeed, they hired him, and he became their assistant scientific director. So it could be that the sugar industry was in this game even before the tobacco industry. So a couple of our papers here. So this was the first paper that I wrote with my colleagues Stan Glantz and Laura Schmidt when I was a fellow. And since I'm a dentist, when I had been working on the Mother Jones article, I kept seeing all these references to tooth decay, which you might hear me say dental caries. That's another word for tooth decay. And so, I wanted to understand what was the sugar industry up to. I mean, clearly we know the links between sugar and tooth decay, but what had the sugar industry been doing in this realm? And so this is from one of their annual reports in 1950. So they actually had a tooth decay research program, and they said the ultimate aim of their foundation was to discover effective means of controlling tooth decay by methods other than restricting carbohydrate intake. So that was pretty clear what they were up to. I looked a little more closely at some of their studies from 1967 to 1970. And here they were actually also collaborating with the chocolate and confectionery industry. So the money that I saw the sugar industry putting into these studies was actually only 4% of the overall budget. So the sugar industry's contribution was $85,000. But then there's the chocolate industry and the candy industry working together. And some examples of the research. So dextranase enzymes, the idea was to create these dextranase enzymes that would break up the plaque on your teeth. So maybe we could add them to toothpaste, or maybe we could add them to foods so that you could eat as much sugar as you want. And if you didn't have the plaque on your teeth, you wouldn't get tooth decay. The other one was a dental caries vaccine. Maybe we can vaccinate for tooth decay. And they dumped a lot of money into this. In fact, people are still trying to come up with a vaccine. This is never going to happen because it's not just one bacteria that causes tooth decay. It's a whole multitude. Anyway, so this is an example of the type of research that they were trying to promote. And then we also found that this time period is actually really critical for research related to tooth decay. So our National Institutes of Health has a dental institute. And in the 1970s, they announced this program called the National Caries Program. And this is a clip from the New York Times writing about this program. And the announcement was, we're going to halt tooth decay within a decade. And actually, how often do you hear that? We're going to end obesity within a generation. We're going to end this in a decade. So here they're saying we're going to end tooth decay within a decade. And so I actually found that the sugar industry was quite interested in this program and cultivated relationships with NIH leaders, pulled together their own research to inform the research priorities, and in fact sent them a report. So the left-hand side is the sugar industry report on what they thought the research priorities should be. And on the right, this is the document that the NIH put out on their final research priorities, and I compared the two. So 78% of the sugar industry report ended up being incorporated into our research priorities for tooth decay in the 1970s, and much of it was verbatim. So here's a quote on the left side, but since it's not practicable to replace sucrose in our diet, can anything be added to mitigate its karyogenicity? That just means make it less cavity-causing. Phosphates are a possible answer. If it's not practicable to replace sucrose in our diet, can anything be added to the diet to mitigate its karyogenicity? Phosphates are a possible answer. So I was just blown away by this, that the sugar industry's report would be incorporated into our dental caries research priorities. This is our federal funding agency influencing what people are researching in this field. And all the non-dietary intervention research was really de-emphasized. And this is actually a really critical time period because that FDA report that I mentioned, where it did acknowledge a link between sugar and tooth decay, that could have informed advertising restrictions. So in the 70s, the Federal Trade Commission, they were actually really looking at trying to limit advertising of sugary breakfast cereals to kids. But the main health reason was tooth decay. But they needed some sort of an objective way to determine what breakfast cereal causes cavities and which doesn't, which cereal is safe, and how do you tell? And that's the research that the NIH could have done, but that's the research that got de-emphasized by this National Caries Program. So I got to understand why the sugar industry really cared about tooth decay so much. So another paper here, now looking at heart disease. So actually, oh no, this is still my dental caries study. So really the conclusion here, just sort of focusing the research on non-dietary interventions as a means to prevent tooth decay. So switching gears to some of their heart disease projects. So the next paper I looked at, I wanted to understand why the sugar industry was funding heart disease research, and they really got interested in this area in 1965, and they funded 9 different projects, spending about $700,000 in today's dollars. And that first project was a literature review, so I decided, okay, let's dig into that and see what they were up to. And we heard a little bit from Jim about the diet-heart hypothesis in the 1950s. This is when the evidence was coming out linking saturated fat to heart disease, and the idea of the low-fat diet was really gaining traction. And this is the president of the Sugar Research Foundation talking to a group of sugar beet growers, talking about an economic opportunity that he saw in the low-fat diet. So if the American public switched to a low-fat diet, this change would mean an increase in the per capita consumption of sugar by more than 1/3. So they were getting very excited about the potential of a low-fat diet back in the 1950s. But they weren't really doing much in heart disease research at that point, but they were watching very closely. So Vice President John Hickson of the Sugar Research Foundation started to notice an uptick of research starting to question the role of sucrose in heart disease. So between 1962 and 1964, he reported that from a number of laboratories of greater or lesser repute, there are flowing reports that sugar is a less desirable dietary source of calories than other carbohydrates, in particular coming from Professor John Yudkin. But they still weren't quite ready to act until 1965, when there was a surge in media attention. So it was the media attention that really was a big factor. So this article came out in the New York Herald Tribune, which was a competitor to the New York Times. That's not around anymore. And it was this big 2-page spread on studies that had come out in the Annals of Maternal Medicine. And it was talking about, briefly, it may be the sugar you eat rather than or in addition to the type of fat in your diet that increases your risk of heart attack. Up to now, the sugar hypothesis had been mainly theoretical, supported by only a few studies. So what these new studies did, in the past, the biomarker that was of most concern was total cholesterol, serum cholesterol. These new studies started to suggest that we needed to be concerned about triglycerides as a biomarker. And these studies showed that overconsumption of sugar could cause elevated triglycerides. And so these were the studies that the sugar industry was getting very nervous about in the 1960s. So what did they do? They commissioned a literature review. Mark Hegsted was their major the lead of the study, and he, at the time, was at the Harvard School of Public Health. His mentor was Fred Stair, who was also a consultant for the sugar industry. But Hegsted was the one that corresponded back and forth with the sugar industry. And in Hegsted's archives at Harvard, it contains the correspondence going back and forth. And so we were able to see that they paid Hegsted $6,500, about $50,000 in today's money. They corresponded back and forth at least 24 times on this literature review. And sugar industry was able to see drafts. So this is the vice president saying, let me assure you, this draft is quite what we had in mind, and we look forward to its appearance in print. And this ended up being a 2-part narrative review. So this was before the meta-analysis days. So it's a narrative review of the literature linking sugar to coronary heart disease versus the literature linking saturated fat to coronary heart disease. And if you're interested, I basically spent a year of my life going through the studies that were evaluated in this paper and assessing them for bias. And there's a massive supplemental file that goes along with this paper that'll give you all the details on what they were up to. But ultimately, their conclusion was that the low-fat diet was the healthiest diet for heart disease, and that saturated fat was the enemy, and that we should switch out saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat. And they did it in a very biased way. And this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, obviously a very prestigious journal, coming from the Harvard School of Public Health. And interestingly, they did disclose some funding from the Nutrition Foundation, which is an industry funding group, but they did not disclose the funding from the Sugar Research Foundation. But, this is the 60s, and so we didn't have the rules like we do now with conflict of interest, but it is interesting that they would choose to disclose one source of industry funding and not the sugar industry's funding. And what's key about these researchers, Hegsted and Stair, is they went on to be very influential in the US dietary guidelines. So post-1977, the next round was in 1980, and Stair was on the group, that reviewed those dietary guidelines that was very lenient on sugar. So, yes. Ultimately, what did we find? So they accentuated the inherent uncertainty of the studies linking sucrose to coronary heart disease, while they overstated the certainty of the body of evidence linking saturated fat to coronary heart disease. So this also gave the sugar industry something to cite. So anytime they were talking to policymakers, they could cite this incredibly influential two-part literature review in the New England Journal of Medicine. So the third study I want to share with you is another heart disease study. After I did the lit review one, I got very curious about some of the studies where they were comparing starch to sucrose. And one thing I should point out in that New England Journal of Medicine review, it wasn't just human studies, they were actually looking at animal studies as well. And the authors dismissed animal studies as being relevant to making any kind of a policy decision for humans. But interestingly, the sugar industry then went on to fund their own animal studies. So I'm like, okay, I wonder what they were up to. So I looked at Project 259, which they called the effect of dietary carbohydrate load on blood lipid level in germ-free rats. So back then, the technology to be able to study rats that did not have a gut microbiome had just been developed. They were very expensive and complicated studies, and they still are, but the sugar industry was really interested in this, and they wanted to feed rats high sucrose versus high starch, and do this with rats that had a normal gut microbiome, and do it with rats that didn't have bacteria, and compare them and see if there was a difference. Ultimately, what they found was that there was a link between the bacteria in the small intestine. And so to get that triglyceride response in the rats, you had to have the bacteria in the small intestine to get the triglyceride response. So in essence, what they were doing is proving to themselves that there was a mechanism to explain the link between sugar consumption and elevated triglycerides, even though they just paid the Harvard guys to claim that triglycerides were not a relevant biomarker and that there was no plausible mechanism to explain the relationship. So this was a 2-year study that wasn't 100% completed. So the lead researcher, Walter Pover, was updating the sugar industry periodically, and he wrote to them saying that he was really close. He just needed something like 16 more weeks and needed to extend his funding. And the sugar industry considered that, and amongst themselves, they were ranking the projects that they'd been funding in heart disease, and ranked Pover's project as having nil value to the sugar industry after getting those initial results. It wasn't going to be supporting the PR message that they were really interested in. So they did not give him that extra funding, and his results were never published. So this is an example, of the sugar industry exploring for themselves these plausible mechanisms and then keeping it to themselves. When we published this paper, several reporters contacted the sugar industry for their comment, and they actually said, well, gee, if Dr. Kearns had just contacted us, we would have given her some more documents that could have helped explain kind of what we were up to. And they actually gave this reporter this one document, and I asked him, I said, did you actually read what they gave you? Because I think it made their case worse. So here's what it said. It says, this is them talking amongst themselves. Of interest are the human implications. It could be that those people showing extreme sucrose-induced hyperlipemia are harboring an atypical intestinal flora. So an example here of what did the sugar industry know and when did they know it? The results suggested that gut microbiota might have a causal role in carbohydrate-induced hypertriglyceridemia. And I actually forgot to mention another finding. So they had an incidental finding as part of this study. They were just sort of looking at all different kinds of things that they could measure in these rats. And they looked at the urine. And they found that there was a difference in beta-glucuronidase between the high-starch-fed rats and the high-sugar-fed rats. And beta-glucuronidase had been linked to bladder cancer at the time. And so they were also talking amongst themselves that, oh, isn't this interesting? We found this bladder cancer biomarker related to a high-sugar diet. And the regulations at the time, certainly the results would have strengthened the case that the CHD risk of sucrose was higher than starch, but also it would have been likely that sucrose might have been scrutinized as a potential carcinogen, because this was the time period when the FDA was also really looking at artificial sweeteners. And there was an artificial sweetener, a class of sweeteners called cyclamates at the time, and it was the bladder cancer results that were the most definitive in linking cyclamates to bladder cancer. And so had these bladder cancer-related sucrose results been made public, the FDA might have scrutinized sugar even more heavily. So just want to give you an idea of the impact of some of these studies. So we've gotten a lot of media attention, which has been wonderful. So some of our research results have been picked up by the New York Times, made it in newspapers all over the world. So it's wonderful to get those messages out to the public. But it's also had an impact in places like the World Health Organization. So this is Dr. Margaret Chan, and she actually quoted our work when talking about public-private partnerships with the food industry and policymaking organizations like the World Health Organization. But we're not quite there yet. When we talk about the tobacco industry is no longer invited to the table in places like the WHO or the UN. But the food industry still is. We still talk about the food industry as being part of the solution, that we can't make the changes that we need to make without working together with the food industry. The food industry, that's a really big term. The tobacco industry, it's much easier to kind of single out tobacco companies. The food industry is very broad. But I think that, it's fair to say that the sugar industry, the sugary food and beverage industry shouldn't be at the table, but they still are. The National Academy of Sciences, I had the chance to be part of a talk looking at trust in nutrition science. It was actually an education to me to really understand that the National Academy of Sciences really isn't a federal agency. It's a private organization, and it's also heavily funded by the food and beverage industry. So there I was at the table for this particular event, and I'm sitting there with all the representatives of the food and beverage industry. And this could be one explanation by some of those Institute of Medicine reports that have exonerated sugar. If you look at the sponsors, they are sponsored by companies like Mars, for example, the global candy manufacturer. I've also now had the chance to work with some collaborators on a series in The Lancet looking at oral health and getting more serious about the links between sugar and oral health. You would think that dentists would be out there leading the charge, but we're not. The American Dental Association doesn't support soda taxes. The American Dental Association is still waiting for more evidence to take action on a policy standpoint. We're fine with doing dietary counseling, in clinical practice, but when it comes to really standing up on the policy level, we still have a long ways to go. And I know Rob's been working with some dental organizations, and we're starting to see some action. But we're not as active as we should be. And so this Lancet group is actually really exciting because this whole series looked at a lot of things having to do with oral health, but it really looked at the sugar industry and what we're calling now commercial determinants of health. And so this really had a focus on commercial determinants of health. And there will be now a commission going forward that will be doing more research and getting more serious about taking those on. And then I also just participated in a side event at the United Nations related to oral health, but here, just sort of to demonstrate dentistry kind of being stuck in the mud, we had global leaders from oral health there, and we had a panel. We had panels on both sides, so pro public-private partnerships and against public-private partnerships, and you can guess the side that I'm on. And I was together with Marion Nessel and Nina Renshaw from the NCD Alliance and Cheryl Hilton from the tobacco world. And people from my own profession were calling us conspiracy theorists and challenging us and just saying some not very nice things. And it's really kind of disheartening to see that. And so when the dentists, when the most visible health effect of sugar aren't up there leading the charge, then something's really wrong. So where am I going next? Just to give you a sense for how much more there is to do. This is just looking at the Sugar Research Foundation and their public health projects that they sponsored between 1943 and 1972. Number of projects, so just on nutrition, 11, cardiovascular disease, 9, 15 different tooth decay projects, 8 different diabetes projects, et cetera. And these all led to hundreds of publications. There's over 300 publications that came out. And I've really only written about a handful of these publications. So there's much, much more to do here. And now that these documents are online, anyone can look at this. And so hopefully, if this is something that you're interested in and you want to know more, you'll take a look at the archive for yourself. And then I'm also very interested in thinking more about the public relations industry, because we talk about it's the sugar industry doing these things or it's Monsanto doing these things, but they're working together with a team of lawyers. They're working together with a team of public relations advisors and consultants that are really helping them cast doubt. They're helping them be critical of the people speaking out. They're helping them get to the policymakers. And we really don't talk about the public relations industry. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's not just health, it's climate change, it's everything going on these days. And this is an example of a public relations plan from the sugar industry documents from the 1940s. And I picked this to show to you because of the box for doctors and dentists on the right-hand side. And here they're recognizing in the 1940s that the beliefs of doctors and dentists, they felt that sugar causes caries and that they were advising against sugar because they believe it's fattening or causes diabetes. And then, they go on with their whole PR plan, and here are the goals to be attained by this program. The doctors and dentists on the right, they want them to no longer regard sugar as a problem food. This is 1945, you guys. They have been doing this for even longer than that, probably a century of launching these public relations campaigns, targeting doctors and dentists specifically with their PR programs. But not only that, educators, nutritionists, and public health experts, and consumers in particular. And they've used very sophisticated tactics to change what we think about sugar, to change our dietary counseling practices, and to sort of decommission us from getting involved in the policy sphere. And then lastly, just to give you a sense for what else is out there to be found, this was me visiting Vanderbilt University, which has a very interesting nutrition science collection, which we've now gotten 3 or 4 of those collections getting put up online right now. But this is a whole bunch of file cabinets that no one has processed, just sitting there, waiting to be explored. And they weren't sure that I was going to be interested. They're like, we have this stuff down in the basement. I was like, really? I went down and I just stood there thumbing through all the stuff, and I just can't believe what else is out there to be found. This was a time, 50s, 60s, 70s, all really important times for when the evidence base was forming on a lot of the dietary guidance that we get now. And it was before computers. Everything was on paper. All of these scientists that were consulting for the various industries, they were writing back and forth, typewriters. And they kept all of that information, and they ended up, in lots of cases, donating it to their universities. And so there's just a ton more information out there to be found. And so stay tuned. There's a lot more to explore. And yes, that's all I have for you. Thanks so much.
questions? Sir.
That was a wonderful talk. And I remember when your famous paper came out with Hegsted, who I'd long learnt to hate, came out. I was particularly pleased by that. I want to make two comments, apart from full of admiration for your work. I published a book a couple of years ago on breakfast, which may sound frivolous, but in fact breakfast is a very dangerous meal. And my problem was, and I came across that accidentally because of my own diabetes, that's how I became interested. My problem was I read paper after paper on breakfast, and then I suddenly had a moment of revelation. And I suddenly realized that every scientist who'd published on breakfast knew what they were actually doing. Because in over 200 papers, almost universally recommending breakfast as being healthy for you. And then once I learnt what the tricks were, and I could learn to anticipate, there are 3 or 4 tricks in breakfast science. All these papers, of course, are funded by Kellogg's or General Mills, or they don't tell you who funds them. I suddenly realized the entire breakfast scientific community was made up of scientists who knew what tricks they were playing. And so to answer your question, I think one of the fundamental problems is it comes from the economists who've told us ever since 1945 that governments should fund science to support industry, which is a myth. But that is a very powerful myth that universities find very convenient. My belief is that government funding of science should be in opposition to industry. Obviously, I don't mean places like CrossFit. I'm talking about the food industry. And that you either work for a government laboratory and get proper rewards and proper funding, or you go over to the dark side. But there should be no links whatsoever between the NSF and the NIH and all these other CDCs with all its charitable arms and industry. It's a recipe for corruption. And your work has done the fantastic step of actually spelling out that corruption, and I congratulate you.
Thank you. Well, I certainly agree with you on that point, and just to get the funding really to do the work that I'm trying to do is actually quite difficult because I'm criticizing the federal agencies that would be the agencies that would fund me to do this work, so it makes it quite challenging. But you're absolutely right, and I think that again, it's sort of this PR propaganda world of the businesses. What they're sort of keeping it from view from us, from what they're doing behind the scenes, and how are we going to really be able to study that with a critical lens? And it's very difficult, and in this current environment, it's even more difficult. Yeah.
Oh, question. Any other questions? Going once? All right, there you go.
Why would a scientist that knowingly does something wrong donate their papers to a university for them to be discovered later?
That's a really good question. Maybe they thought they weren't doing anything wrong. I think that, at the time, sort of the low-fat diet, that whole era, that was really the status quo. And so I could envision, being able to convince yourself that you were doing the right thing. But I also think that there are people out there doing the wrong thing on purpose.